Hi, everyone. This is Betsy Wurzel, your host of Chatting with Betsy on Passionate World Talk Radio, where our mantra is to educate, enlighten, and entertain. The views of the guest may not represent those of the host of the station. Please bear with my voice. I have no idea why I still have hoarseness. But the show must go on, and I don't let anything stop me. Excuse me. And with me today, I have a very special guest. All my guests are special. And, yes, I get excited about every guest and every show that I do because I am very passionate about what I do. And I'm very passionate about the guest I have today because it really touches my heart. It's topic close to my heart. With me today is Lauren K. Johnson, who was an Air Force veteran. She's an author and writer of this wonderful book, The Fine Art of Camouflage, which I highly, highly recommend to read. And I not only want to thank Lauren K. Johnson for coming on my show, I want to thank Lauren K. Johnson for writing this book, for her service, and being brave enough to show her authentic self in this book. And if you know any veterans, anyone going into the service, please buy this book for them. I want to welcome Lauren K. Johnson to Chatting with Betsy. Welcome, Lauren K.
Thank you so much for that wonderful welcome, Betsy. It's really great to be here with you.
Well, it is my honor, really, and you are welcome. First off, I have to tell you, I love the cover of your book. I love the title. And so I'm going to start with that. How did you come up with your title?
I actually had a few bloopers en route to the final decision. I worked on this book for the better part of 12 years, and of course,
wow.
the manuscript evolved a lot, and certain themes began to emerge. And what ultimately kind of became a major through line is the topic of information and communication. My role in the military was communicating. I was a public affairs officer, so basically PR for the military. And when I deployed to Afghanistan in 2009-2010, I served on a unit that was focused on the counterinsurgency mission, nation building, the winning hearts and minds slogan that you heard a lot back in that era. And my specific role on that was information operations. So kind of the similar PR thing, but with a much more overt attempt to influence. So a lot of information filtering, some information spinning. And as I was working through the manuscript, I started to realize that type of information twisting is kind of an inherent part of all of our lives, and just the nature of kind of being human in this day and age, and all of the influence we have from different media sources and social media, and the stories we hear growing up, the stories I heard growing up of my family's history of military service. My grandfathers both served, my mother served and deployed to the first Gulf War when I was 7. So all of these layers of stories that we hear and that we tell each other and tell ourselves. And I liked the play on camouflage because obviously there's a military connection there. But for me personally, it also kind of captures the way that we project ourselves to the world and to the people we care about, how rarely what we see out in the world about anybody or about any situation is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So kind of these layers of camouflage that we all just acquire as we go through life.
Oh, that's so true, Lauren. And, what I like about the title is The Fine Art of Camouflage is, I'm sure being in the military service, you had to camouflage your feelings. You couldn't show how you felt.
Absolutely. Yes.
You would be judged.
The military is not really a place that encourages vulnerability. And,
right.
In a lot of ways, out of necessity. And when you're in a situation where it's life or death, you can't really afford to step back and, ponder the meaning of life and the potential, emotional, psychological repercussions of everything you're doing, because you would be distracted from the here and now, which is very much focused on staying alive and keeping the people around you alive. It's just when you are back in a more normal situation that's not life and death, that doesn't really translate. And there's, of course, some transition needed, but it's very abrupt when you're suddenly thrust back into real life, trying to, normalize yourself.
Yes. Which, since you brought that up, I might as well ask this question while I think about it. I think I might have ADHD in my old age. I go, my attention span, I just pop around when I ask questions. But when
I appreciate those kind of conversations.
Okay, because when you were in the military, and that was you said 2009, 2010. When you went back to civilian life, did they de-stress you? Did they offer you any counseling? Because I know, I grew up during Vietnam, and they just one day they're in the jungle, the next day they're in the U.S. with no counseling at all.
Yeah, so I was serving active duty, which has a bit more structure to it. And one of the interesting things for me when I was writing this book was I kind of do some compare and contrast between my experience and my mother's experience. And my mom served primarily as an Army reservist, and she was in the reserves when her unit was activated to deploy. So when she got back, she didn't have this base community. She was, a part-time soldier, and she went back to her regular everyday life as a civilian nurse and as a mom and, cook-to-order chef and a taxi driver and all these other things that moms are. And she didn't have any kind of supportive infrastructure. When I got back, I had some semblance of that. They do in the military screen you for different concerns and let you know the resources available. But one of the big challenges is that despite having things available to you, it really does rely on the individual to take advantage of those resources. I didn't do that right away.
Exactly.
I actually kind of was a little dishonest when I went through that initial screening, as a lot of people are. There's kind of a joke about the screenings about alcohol use, and I reference that in my book too. I kind of just checked no to all of them, even though alcohol use became a coping mechanism for me, as it does for many people. But nobody wants to get referred to alcohol counseling. It's one extra thing that nobody wants on their record, nobody wants to have to deal with. So everybody just kind of checks no. And that's unfortunately the reality for a lot of people, is that you're in denial, you don't want to seek help, you don't think you need it, or you need it, but you don't want it on your record, or you're afraid of the stigma around it. Those are all very real issues. There's still concerns about it impacting your military career, your chances at promotion. So I eventually did self-refer and go to the mental health clinic, because I kind of got sick of myself in this wallowing, ridiculous state that I felt I was in. But a lot of people, unfortunately, don't get to that point, or don't get there until it gets really, really bad. And that's a challenge that the military has been dealing with for many, many years, and I think has gotten better in some ways. But the real kicker is that it does still rely on the individual to seek out those services. And when you're in an environment that doesn't encourage that kind of vulnerability, and that still has so much stigma attached to mental health care, that's a big barrier.
That was priceless, Lauren. What you said was priceless, because it's so true. I'm a big mental health advocate, and I've done a lot of shows about mental health. And people, and I know men especially, they hide. They have to be like this John Wayne type, the strong, silent type. And that's why the suicide rate among men are high, and that's a whole other show, so I won't really go into that. But I have interviewed men, and I just have to say to the guys out there and, to parents, guardians, it's not a weakness to go for help. We need to teach our sons that it's okay to show emotion in a safe environment and that it's okay to reach out for help. And that has to change, and it's going to take a long time, I think, Lauren, for society to change how they treat men, young boys, and, just men. It's a stigma. It is a stigma. I've even interviewed doctors, Lauren, and they can't even go for help because they'll go against their license. And that's so unfair.
There's a lot wrong with the system. And you're absolutely right.
Yes.
It's a cultural change. And change like that takes time and takes, shifting at the ground level in order to kind of, filter up to the top levels where it has that top-down support.
Yes. So that's why, I was just loved your book because you're honest, you're real, and you could just tell the raw emotion. I'm thinking, oh, if Laura was standing in front of me, I would hug this woman and tell her, it's a brave person really to expose themselves and how they felt. And we'll backtrack. So your mom was also in the service, and she went away when you were, I think, 7 years old. That had to have an effect on you, and you joined the service. So I'm kind of interested as to how had your mom serving affected you and why you joined, yes, and did she discourage you? And your dad, did they discourage you to join?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's something that I thought a lot about as I was writing, and I don't think I really knew the answer until I explored it in writing this book. So my mom, deploying suddenly when I was 7, this was an era before deployments were a predictability for people serving in the military, especially as a reservist. My mom was part of a hospital unit based in Seattle that was huge. It had 750 personnel, and part of the reason she joined that unit is because it was so big, it would be really expensive to deploy. So they kind of figured, we're safe. We'll never deploy unless there's World War III. And what people don't often think about now, looking back at Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm, is that there was concern at the time that it might be World War III. Saddam Hussein was so unpredictable. There was the threat of chemical warfare. Perhaps Israel would get involved. There would be some kind of nuclear component. So there was just so much uncertainty swirling around that time. My mom's orders were for an undetermined length of up to 2 years. She thought because of the threat of chemical warfare, it might be a suicide mission. So much unknown. And looking back with the gift of hindsight, we see it, was basically over in 4 months. My mom was gone for 3 months. That, in hindsight was almost a best case scenario, but it didn't feel that way at the time. And
right.
Of course, I wasn't privy to all of that information as a 7-year-old.
Right.
But
yeah, and
I knew that my mom was gone.
Yeah, and as a child, 7, 3 months without your mom had to seem like an eternity.
It did, and we didn't have an end date. So that unknown was just looming over everyone. And we didn't have email, so it wasn't, the type of instantaneous communication that we've gotten spoiled with this day and age. We got phone calls, once a week or so. She would send us mail whenever she could, and it was just like these little, almost like appetizers of her presence, but nothing satisfying. And I was just overwhelmed by, not knowing and by just being lonely without my mom. She was really my person. So it is weird to think back. Of my siblings, I have an older sister and a younger brother. My sister turned 9 while my mom was gone. My younger brother was barely 2, so he was really too young to understand what was happening, just knew that mommy was gone. And my sister and I both expressed our grief in different ways, but I was definitely more overtly affected. And it is weird that I was the one to join the military. So I've done a lot of thinking about that and a lot of writing about it. And it really comes down to kind of a convergence of factors. I turned 18 right after 9/11 and was on the West Coast, so 9/11 didn't impact us directly as a family in the way that it did your community, for example, out on the East Coast. But there was this very strong emotional connection for me in kind of the general patriotic feeling of the country right after 9/11 that was very similar to the feeling when my mom got back from Desert Storm. And I remember, there's a scene in my book, I remember so strongly driving home from school the afternoon of September 11th, and the streets were lined with people waving American flags and signs, honk if you love America. And I just I found myself honking. I just kind of wasn't even conscious of what I was doing. I was honking and I was cheering. And then I made a turn toward home, and Lee Greenwood's God Bless the USA came on the radio. And that was a song that came out during Desert Storm. It was kind of an anthem for my mom's unit.
Yeah.
It's still played in bars everywhere there's a military town. And it just, that connection, that swell of patriotism, all the emotions I felt about 9/11, and then thinking about Desert Storm, and it just created this really, really powerful swell of emotion in me, and it was like something awakened. And I identify that thing that awakened as this desire to follow in my family's footsteps, and specifically my mom's footsteps. My mom was my hero, even before she deployed. So I know that there was a part of me that wanted to be like her and do something like her and like my grandfathers had done. And, of course, 9/11 was a trigger, and then I got a full scholarship through ROTC to my dream school up at Beach in Southern California. So on the surface level, it was kind of, I'm joining the military to get a college scholarship and to go to my dream school. I'm 18, I'm naive, I don't really know what I'm getting into. But there was a lot of this undercurrent of patriotism and following in my mom's footsteps as well.
That was, I thought that was incredible. Your book, Lauren, reminded me of a book I read probably over 20 years ago of a nurse who went over to Vietnam. And the reason why it reminded me of this nurse, I can't even remember the name of the book, to be honest with you. She was over there for, I think, maybe 18 months or 2 years. And she went because, it was back in the day, John F. Kennedy, President John F. Kennedy was like, don't ask what you could do, what your country could do for you, ask what you could do for your country, and the patriotism back then. And, then she was there, so what was going on, and then questioned, why am I here? Like, what are we doing here? Yeah. And I, got that message from you in your book that you sometimes question, like, what am I doing here? What are we doing here? And then you might feel guilty for that, right? Like, I shouldn't be feeling that way. I signed up for this, a lot of conflicting emotions, I'm sure.
Absolutely. And that's part of, I call this my coming of age story, and it really is. And, the military in a lot of ways is a coming of age experience because you join when you're on the cusp of adulthood. And there's a reason for that, because the military needs people who are young and strong and physically capable, but also people who are, a little mentally pliable and can be molded into good soldiers. And I went into my military experience and certainly my deployment experience. I volunteered to go to Afghanistan. And part of that was because I knew, I was going to go somewhere eventually anyway. That was just the reality in my era of service, and I kind of wanted to choose my own fate. But I also felt like I needed to do my duty, and like I really wanted to do something meaningful. And the mission that I chose to be a part of, a provincial reconstruction team, with that, winning hearts and minds and building schools and roads and shaking hands and kissing babies kind of thing, I really just had a very romanticized view of what that was. And I went in to the experience thinking about everything that I'd heard about what that mission would be like. I read Greg Mortenson's memoir, 3 Cups of Tea, which came out in 2007 about an American mountaineer building schools in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And that was like a huge, almost required reading book in the military at that time. And the military leadership was looking at that book as a model for how to, work with the local community in these regions and build up infrastructure, which was basically my job. And I went in with the mindset that many Americans had in this new era, that war is like it was in Desert Storm. It's quick and decisive, and there's a defined enemy. And of course, by the time I was in Afghanistan, we were 8+ years into the war, and it's pretty obvious that wasn't the case. But denial can be very powerful in those instances, and part of the challenge for me was that my expectations clashed very, very harshly with reality, in that it was just so much more complicated than I could have possibly imagined. And there were so many more factors at play, and it was so just emotionally and mentally draining, and there was so much confusion and frustration and inability to do the things that felt like they might be meaningful. So a lot of questioning, and then you're right, a lot of guilt about that, and even that guilt followed me home too, when I felt unsettled and like I had experienced trauma, but I couldn't pinpoint that trauma. It was just like a cumulative effect of being in this confusing, frustrating environment, and I felt like I'd done some things that went against my morals, but that didn't seem like an acceptable trauma-inducing experience. Like, I hadn't been in combat. I hadn't fired my weapon. No one in my unit had been seriously injured or killed. So I felt like I didn't deserve to suffer in that way.
And I would think that that's very common. Men and women go into the service with expectations, and then it's quite different, than what they had expected. And having that inner turmoil, or you might not have, been in combat yourself, but you knew people that were in combat and killed. And, I think if I can remember correctly, I read your book a couple of months ago, in Afghanistan, you didn't know who your enemy was. They were in disguise. They, pretended to be friends of the Americans, and then next thing you know, your base is blown to bits. Don't mean to be graphic, people, but I am from New Jersey, so say like.
It was an era where there were a lot of what has been come to be called green on blue attacks. So supposed friends, the Afghan security forces that we were partnering very closely with would turn and attack the coalition forces they were working with. So these insider attacks, and that was an ever-present threat. And oddly, in kind of the like caustic irony of war, this was all building up as the effort to like play nice with the locals was building up too. And this effort to, instead of Americans leading operations, to do joint operations with the Afghans to help them build their own capacity. The whole metaphor about teaching a man to fish versus bringing him fish. So it makes sense. That's what we wanted to do. But the fact that this was happening at the same time that the insider attacks were really spinning up, it felt like, we're putting ourselves in a very vulnerable position.
Yes, I tell you what, reading your book, my heart was in my throat when you went out to, you would venture out to go to different meetings, and I'm like, oh no, and I couldn't stop reading the book. I was like, I gotta read what happened. I hope Lauren doesn't get hurt. And it was a very interesting book, and this is the first book I read about someone who was over in Afghanistan. I read a lot of books about Vietnam, but that was after the fact. I didn't read books about Vietnam until I was in my 30s. if not 40s. And I just really, feel for the Vietnam vets who weren't thanked when they got home, who were spat on. Did you, when you came home from your military service, did people treat you respectfully or not? Were you looked down on because you went over there?
By and large, I was received very positively. There's a lot of gratitude for veterans. I think that we've gotten to an era, thankfully, where for the most part people are able to separate the conflict from those engaging in the conflict and recognize that there are, greater political and economic forces at play. That was not the case in Vietnam, and that was, a really, really dark era for this country, I think.
Yes, I always say, you know what, Oh, go ahead, Lauren.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think, it in a way was easier for me because I had been in Afghanistan and not Iraq, where Iraq was such a controversial conflict, still is. And that controversy didn't extend in the same way to Afghanistan. We had a more, rational, logical reason for being there. So that was a bit of a buffer for me, I think, with some of the protests and the controversy swirling around the war effort. But by the time I got home, it was more like folks were just pretty detached from it. And I would get, the gratitude for my service and marched in a couple veterans parades. And while I appreciated that sentiment, it did feel very superficial in a lot of ways. Like, people couldn't possibly understand what I'd been through, which, of course they couldn't because I hadn't yet really shared that. So it's kind of a double-edged sword there too, is there's a lot, that veterans need to do to share the experience and open that window for civilians. And civilians need to be able to engage in it in more than a surface level, in more than saying, thank you for your service, actually having those difficult conversations, asking those difficult questions, and being open to really challenging discussions about all of the nuances of being in that environment, because it's not black and white by any means. And of course there's political elements and economic elements, but it is at its core a human experience, and every human going through it has a full spectrum of emotions and so much wrapped up in that individually.
Oh, absolutely. I always think of veteran, especially around Memorial Day, when they're doing the poppies, and I always thank them. I have to tell you this story. I worked as a nurse, and I was reading the book about this nurse in Vietnam that I was just discussing, and I said to the guy, Larry, I knew he was in Vietnam, and I said, Larry, thank you for going over to Vietnam and serving your country. And he looked at me, and he started to cry, and he gave me a hug. He said, Betsy, no one ever thanked me. Thank you for saying that. I mean, the man was in tears. And all I said was, thank you for your service. And I said, I apologize. I said, I apologize on behalf of how you were treated by people. I tell folks, you don't have to agree with a war. You don't have to agree with politicians. But you know what? Support the troops. Support the men and the women who serve, because they're doing their job. And they're caught in that, the politics of a war, of, what they're allowed to do, what they're not allowed to do. And I just say support the troops. Show your gratitude to a veteran. And we need to help the veterans. And that's that could be a whole nother show too.
Yeah, it could be a whole other book for me too. Yeah, well, and you bring up an interesting point looking at Vietnam versus the post 9/11 era, and another huge difference is that everyone serving now has volunteered to serve. So those folks who came back from Vietnam and were spat on and not thanked for their service. Many of them didn't even want to be serving. It wasn't their choice. They were drafted. Now,
Yes.
That's not the case. We don't have a draft anymore. So everyone is going on their own. They're making that decision to go. And that, is noble in a way, but it also adds a layer of complication for folks who come back and have that kind of guilt and mental health issues that they're wrestling with, knowing that I chose to be there. I knew what I was signing up for. I should have known what I was getting myself into. So it's kind of another complicated nuance, as so many things are with war.
Yeah. People think they know what they're signing up for, but sometimes it turns out to be so completely different. And folks, I feel really strongly about this. And if you listen to my show, men and women who served our country deserve to have mental health benefits to go without judgment, without the stigma associated with that. They have a right to say, I need help. And I think veterans should get all the help and assistance they need. They deserve it. And I'm not into politics, but I'm very strong about that, and not ashamed to say it. So I just think that mental health, and I know the suicide rate is up, and veterans, unfortunately, do have a high suicide rate, and that makes me sad. I think we could do better for our veterans. Of course, the individuals themselves need to recognize that they need help. And you have 2 twin little girls. Would you?
I do.
Congratulations. Would you discourage them? You're welcome. From serving their country they wanted to, or discourage them?
That's something that has been on my mind a lot lately. And my girls are 2 years old, so thankfully I have a bit of time before we get to the point where we're having those types of discussions. But they were born actually right before the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Afghanistan. They were born in June of 2021. So they were about 2 months old when that was happening, and it felt for me like a very, very important reflection point as I was looking back on my experience and thinking about my mother's experience from a new lens as a parent now myself, and thinking about what I'm going to tell my kids someday about my service. And, all of these stories that I consumed growing up and that I consumed before deploying and while I was deployed, and the stories I shared, how am I going to remove the filter on that to talk to my kids in a genuine way? And that's really what I want to do. I hope that they don't join the military. My mom and I both have said we hope the family business ends with me. But if they express interest, I couldn't turn them away from a choice that I made myself, and from something that, despite the challenges involved and some traumatic experiences, I did learn a lot from the military and got some incredible experiences and met some amazing people. So there was a lot of good that I took out of my military time as well. And I wouldn't deny my kids that opportunity. I would just want them to be as educated as they possibly could about what that means. And this is the same advice I would give anyone considering joining the military. Just to have those difficult conversations before you sign on the dotted line and before you end up in the middle of a war zone and realize you have no idea what you've gotten yourself into. Just try to expand your view of what that might be like by reading accounts of people who have served, by talking to people who have served and are currently serving, and just consuming as much information as possible to help kind of triangulate, where the truth lies in all of these different stories that are surrounding us, and how you feel about that, and really, own that piece of it and do that self-reflection to figure out how this would all, sit with you.
That's good advice. Yes. find out as much as you possibly can. There was, might have been after, no, it was before 9/11. There was a guy who owned a coffee shop downtown, and he said, he served in Vietnam, he said that he would put his son in a dress and ship him up to Canada. He did not want his son going to serve in the service. He was like very adamant. I don't want my son to serve. I don't want him to go through what I went through. And
that's very understandable.
Yeah, yes, it is. I just admire people who go over there anywhere, to serve. My dad served in World War II. He was in the Navy, and his ship got kamikaze twice. He was on the Bunker Hill. Once, the second he asked to get off, and he served the rest of the time on a cargo ship. My uncle was in Europe, and my grandmother would say Jack didn't come home the same. He would punch walls. Of course he didn't come home the same. Who can't come home the same? This is what I wish people would understand, Lauren, that when a man or a woman goes overseas, and I'm going to be very frank here, sees traumatic things, they are going to have post-traumatic stress disorder or injury or whatever you want to call it. They're not going to come back the same. They not only come back sometimes physically injured, but also mentally. And maybe they don't come back physically injured, but they do have injury emotionally. And we, the public, we need to understand this. And I wish everybody would understand this. And I'm very passionate about that too, Lord. I'm passionate about a lot of things, as you can tell.
Well, we need advocates in that space, absolutely. And I'll add to that too. I really firmly think everyone is impacted by their experience, and I don't think it's a stretch to say that, to compare it to any other kind of life-altering experience. So even if it's like I studied abroad for a month in college in a foreign place, and I came back, and I was never quite the same because I got a different perspective, and I saw how other people lived, and I had new experiences. Anyone who's had any kind of experience outside their normal life and kind of been plucked from their life and then plopped back in it, you're going to be changed. And the military is kind of an amplified version of that. And of course, some people have those really intense traumatic experiences that amplifies it even more, and other people it's more subtle. And some people, probably most people, are somewhere in the middle. I'm certainly a middle person, and that's part of what I want to communicate with my book, is that is a vast spectrum of experiences. And the stories we tend to see are the ones that at the far end, the very intense moments of combat and extreme post-traumatic stress. And those are very real and very valid stories. But it's important to acknowledge the spectrum of other stories as well.
Absolutely. And I'm sure you probably felt, this is what I got from reading your book, that you didn't want to give yourself permission to say in the beginning, I'm having post-traumatic. I shouldn't be having it because I wasn't in, this battle or that battle. Why am I feeling this way? We don't give ourselves permission a lot of times to sift through our pain. And
for me, it goes back to that.
Go ahead.
Yeah, it goes back to that feeling of guilt, like I didn't deserve to be there because I hadn't had one of those intense trauma-inducing experiences. And I even experienced that in therapy. I went through cognitive behavioral therapy, which focuses on identifying a trauma-inducing moment and looking at it over and over and over again to kind of desensitize yourself to it. And when I was asked to identify a single trauma-inducing moment, I couldn't, because it was kind of a 9-month period of my life. So even like the therapy model that I was put in didn't fit my experience. So again, that's, acknowledging the spectrum. And I think we have made a lot of progress in the last several years. And to be clear, I wasn't actually ever officially diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. My official diagnosis when I left the military was chronic adjustment disorder, which I kind of called at the time like PTSD light. I didn't quite check all of the boxes. But in hindsight, now there's a new term that I feel like is a much better fit for my experience, which is moral injury. And that's really just become part of the conversation in the last decade or so. And moral injury refers to not the psychological injury like PTSD and not a physical injury, but an injury of the soul. So looking at those experiences that I had where I felt like, I was filtering information so that the Afghan people didn't know the reality of, like their government situation. I felt like I was referring them to a broken system. And the American public, I felt like I wasn't giving enough information to make informed decisions about the continued war effort. I felt like I, was spinning information. There was an information cover-up while I was in Afghanistan that involved civilian casualties. So these things that I felt like I was a part of or I was a witness to that were in conflict with my morals, like that hurt my soul. And that's kind of what moral injury refers to. It's a term that kind of came about in discussion of the military, but it applies to a lot of these other groups that you've mentioned, like first responders and providers who have been involved in the front lines of COVID healthcare, having to make these difficult triage decisions, not having the resources that they need to care for patients in the way that they want to, trying to care for patients who don't want their care. So a lot of those like moral and ethical complications are really captured much better in that term.
Wow, you know what? That is so powerful, Lauren. And thank you for mentioning that injury of the soul, moral injury. And I think a lot of people have that. You're trained to do something. You think you're over somewhere to do a job, or even if you're not in the service, say you're working in a hospital, and you see things going on that are against your morals, or you have to make a decision as a doctor, as a nurse, that are against your morals. Yes, I can definitely understand to a certain extent moral injury. I think I might have that myself in caregiving for my husband, trying to get people to believe me of what was going on with Matt, and to see how people treat and disrespect those who have Alzheimer's. It hurt my soul deeply. And, of course, I went on the war path and opening up my mouth. But,
well, and
definitely.
That's how things change. I mean, it takes, individual grassroots efforts like that to be trumpeting these types of things and having frank discussions about it. So thank you for playing that role. And that's, a role that I want to play too with this book. That's a big part of why I'm grateful that it's out in the world, is to hopefully have some new types of conversations about mental health care.
Absolutely. We need stories like yours, Lauren. We need books. We need people to speak up. I've always been saying this for a long time. I first went into my car, I think 2016 or 17, I don't remember, and started to speak up about different things. And now it's funny because now on Instagram I see a lot of people doing videos in their car. I was ahead of my time again.
I think Will Smith was doing that a while ago too. Yeah, you really set the standard there.
To speak out, if we don't share our stories, to me it's being selfish. We're holding back information. We need to hear stories from military veterans. We need to hear people's stories, first responders, whatever area someone serves. We need to hear your stories. I have to ask you, were you exposed to the burn pits?
I was. I wasn't in an area where there was a huge, really toxic presence of those. Some places where they were, had burning oil wells and massive burn pits. Because I was on a very small base in a remote area, we had our own kind of little burn pit, which wasn't nothing, but wasn't as impactful as a lot of areas were.
As I interviewed somebody probably like a year and a half ago about the burn pits, and then a few months later, I read where they are. They recognized that the veterans suffered from the being exposed to the toxins of the burn pits.
They just passed some legislation, the PACT Act. So if any veterans are listening and were exposed to burn pits in your service, go check out the PACT Act. You are eligible to submit a claim. If you're not feeling any effects currently, that doesn't preclude you from submitting a claim. This captures things that may happen in the future too. They're linking cases of cancer and other serious illness to burn pit exposure. So I'm really glad that is happening. Better late than never.
Yes, that's true. And I had to ask you this, Lauren, before I finished. As a female, how were you treated when you went out to the areas that you were in Afghanistan? Were you treated differently? I mean, you probably had to be. I know you had to have your head covered. They treat you different than a male? I'm assuming yes, but I don't want to answer.
A lot of times, yes. Yeah, I wore a headscarf anytime I was off base, as a respect for local customs where women would cover their heads. I was in a more conservative area in Afghanistan, so my being a woman probably had a bit more of a spotlight on it than in some of the other areas that were not quite as conservative. So wore headscarves. I would go to these meetings with government officials, and I would be one of, just me or maybe one other woman, and we would all be standing in a receiving line in our body armor where we all, kind of look the same until you get close. And as the locals got close, they would notice that I was a woman. And some of them would skip right over me and not shake my hand. They just didn't want anything to do with me. Some would kind of like warily shake my hand and as a, gesture, this unit gives us money, we should probably be nice to her. And then some were just really, really excited to see me. Like I was this exciting anomaly that was gracing them with my presence. And we would get on the news, get our pictures taken just strictly because of our gender, which was, weird and uncomfortable. So it was just, kind of a spotlight following me everywhere, which, had its benefits in that I could, get noticed when I wanted to, but if I didn't want to, that spotlight was still there.
And how about in the military itself? Did you face harassment?
I faced some minor harassment, certainly nothing to the extent that a lot of people do. And I know women and men who have encountered military sexual trauma and sexual abuse, which is a horrible, horrible thing to have to deal with in any circumstances, particularly in a deployed environment with a group of people that you're supposed to be able to trust with your life. It's a heavy thing that hangs over everyone in that environment, just as a very real possibility. I was fortunate that I didn't experience that. And for the most part, I had a really wonderful, supportive team, and we all looked out for each other. And I mean, they knew I was a woman, but I did my job and carried my two weapons, I guess, with enough, enough confidence to look moderately competent and as a soldier. So my experience in that realm was pretty minor. Where my gender was most apparent was definitely out with locals.
Well, I can't thank you enough, Lauren K. Johnson, for coming on my show, talking to me, and writing your book Folks, the name of the book is The Fine Art of Camouflage. I love the cover. It's got camouflage on there. Where can people purchase the book, Lauren?
I always recommend purchasing from your local bookstore. It's distributed by a national distributor, so if they don't have it on the shelves at your local bookstore, they can probably order it for you. It's also available at bookshop.org, Barnes & Noble, and Amazon.com.
And got to ask you this before I started recording. If someone wanted to get in touch with you, do you have a way people can communicate with you?
Absolutely. I have a website. It's laurenkjohnson.com, and the K is spelled K-A-Y, laurenkjohnson.com, and there's a contact form on there. Folks can shoot me an email. And if I'm not busy with my full-time job or wrangling twin girls, I will respond as quickly as I can.
Lauren, I wish you the best of luck and much success on your book. Folks, I'm telling you, it's not that I say every time I read a book, and I'm not getting any kickbacks, that it's wonderful. This is a book really that needs to be read. It touched my heart. I've read many books about, Vietnam and that have touched my heart, and I never read a book until recently, a couple of months ago, about someone who served over in Afghanistan, and it was, some things were similar and some things were very different. So I highly recommend buying this book. We need to have these discussions, and I want to commend you, Lauren, again, for being brave to writing your book. And it takes a lot to say, this is what I went through, this is what I was dealing with, or I'm still dealing with it. And I just think that more people need to do it. And I think when people hear stories like your experience, Lauren, maybe it'll encourage them to write a book or to at least seek help and share their story.
Just to have conversations about it, absolutely. Sharing your story is a really powerful thing.
Yes, definitely. Hug your babies for me. I love babies. I love toddlers.
All right.
And I just want to thank you again for coming on, and thank you again for your service. Folks, all the information about Lauren K. Johnson will be in the blog that Jeannie White, who's station manager, writes, and Jeannie White produces the show. So I want to thank Jeannie White for all that she does as station manager. And I want to thank Lillian Caldwell, who's CEO of Passion World Talk Radio, who makes this all possible. And I want to thank you, the listeners. Thank you for listening. Thank you for subscribing. If you don't already subscribe to Chatting with Betsy, it is free on Spreaker, Spotify, iHeart, YouTube, to name just a few. You never know who I will have on. So please subscribe, share with a friend. My joy, my mission is to help other people. And I can only do that if you share the show. That helps me get the word out. I provide resources to help people. I want everyone to know they're not alone. If you're a military veteran, you're not alone. There's help out there. And even if you're not a military veteran, and if you're struggling, there is help out there. Talk to your primary care physician for referrals in your area, because the show goes all over, and I don't know what's available except the suicide hotline, which is 988 in the U.S. And I just, very passionate about mental health. We have to stop the stigma that surrounds that. If a football player gets injured, it's okay when they go get, checked for that. But why can't someone who has an injury to their emotional and mental status, why is there stigma surrounding that? There shouldn't be. And I'm trying to change the world via my show and using my microphone to help change society and how they think of things. We need to stop the stigma surrounding mental health. And folks, I'll tell you this right now. I am not ashamed to say I am seeing a psychologist for caregiver post-traumatic injury. That's right. I have no shame in saying that. And I hope that encourages someone to seek help. Check your senior centers. I've gotten grief counseling for free through my local senior center if you're a senior citizen. But I just wanted to say that. And as I always say at the end of my show, in a world where you could be anything, to please be kind and shine your light bright, because we need that. And also, you can follow me on my Facebook page, Betsy, B-E-T-S-Y, middle initial E, Wurzel, W-U-R-Z-E-L. I'm going to share the cover of Lauren K. Johnson's book, The Fine Art of Camouflage. You will see it on my Facebook page. You'll see it on my LinkedIn page. Why? Because I believe in promoting wonderful books. And if you do need a support group, if you are a caregiver, check out my caregiving group, #KICK, Alzheimer's Ass Movement. And that's it for today, folks. Thanks again for listening. This is Betsy Wurzel, your host of Chatting with Betsy on Passionate World Talk Radio. Bye-bye now.